L'kuta Sichis Chelek Chafhei Vayeshev Yutes Kislev Lili Nishmas of Vayeshev Benjamin Ben Rabbi Moshe Kaltman. She is Yutes Kislev of der Welt. And today we're going to learn what is the Geula of Yutes Kislev. What is unique about what happened on Yutes Kislev, and how does that relate specifically to Parshas Vayeshev? Says Yadua Basar Shalosh Rabbi Parshas Seinu. As alle mehr der Ashana ben Ashachas bin Yenem zu die Parshas Hatere was werden gelernt in Manim, in welchen die mehr dem seinen Chol, the Shalah writes in a number of places, including in our Parsha, that all of the Yom Tevim, all of the festivals that take place during the year have a connection to the Parsha during which they are being celebrated. Including those festivals, those Yom Tevim that were instituted after the Parsha was given, after the Parsha was divided. So it's understood with regard to the Moyed, as the Alter Rebbe refers to Yutes Kislev as a Moyed, a festival. And the Frierdiker Rebbe refers to it as Chag HaChagim, the Yom Tiv of all Yom Tovim. So it's certainly understood, which is Kislev in most years, including this year, falls out in Parshas Vayeshev, as they're taken from them Yom Tiv is verbunden numerumas in Parshas Vayeshev, that the theme of the Yom Tiv of Yutes Kislev will be connected and alluded to in the Parsha of Vayeshev. Hashkafa Rishayna aber is nit nor was gefin mir nit as the Teichen Parshas Haben Ashayches zu when you von Yutes Kislev, but when you at first glance, not only do we not see a connection between the theme of the Parsha and the idea of Yutes Kislev, but adrabah lecheir is the Parsha beteichen afchim Yutes Kislev. It seems that the Parsha is the opposite theme of Yutes Kislev. Why is that? Because Yutes Kislev is der Tag was Chufsha nitn aloi zum Alten Rebbe. Yutes Kislev is the day that freedom was given to the Alter Rebbe from jail. And it is the day of redemption for the teachings of Chassidus, as it is well known. Dagegen in der Parsha, whereas in the Parsha, it's actually discussing the beginning of what caused the Jewish people to descend to Mitzrayim. Von dem was Yaakov Avinu hat geschickt Yosef in Emek Chevron und die weiterdicke Urais, beginning earlier in the Parsha, where Yaakov sends Yosef from Emek Chevron to go see how the brothers are doing, which led to the fact that they should throw him into the pit, etc. Then later in the Parsha, Yosef is sold and then brought down to Mitzrayim, which ultimately led that Yaakov Avinu ended up in Mitzrayim. As the Medrash says, was bringt the mashal in the form of a mashal. The cow was being taken to the slaughterhouse, but it wouldn't go. What did they do? So they drew the son, the child, the calf first. And then the mother cow went after its child against its better judgment. Yaakov was worthy, meaning to say it could have happened that Yaakov would go down to Mitzrayim in chains. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his chains, Kelorin is a prisoner's collar. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'ni B'chayri, Ani Marida B'bizoyin. So Hashem says, this is my child, my firstborn child. I'm going to drag him down and embarrass him. I'll draw his child first. I will drag his child first, and then he'll have no choice but go after him against his better judgment. So Yosef went down to Mitzrayim, and this brought Yaakov to Mitzrayim, which was part of the plan, but in order to get Yaakov to go down, Yosef was taken first. So the question becomes, Parshas Vayeshev is discussing the Yerida, the descent into Mitzrayim, first of Yosef, which wasn't just Yosef's personal descent, it was the beginning of a whole descent of the Jewish people. So how does that connect with Yutes Kislev, which is about the freedom and the liberation of the Alter Rebbe and Teres Achsidus? So let's explain the connection al pi hayadua, according to that which is known as Galus Mitzrayim is nit given al Galus Mitzrayim was not a punishment. nor verkehrt, the tachlis davon is gewend, der wachlich in jetze bruchus Gadol. The purpose of going down to Mitzrayim was that they would go out with great wealth. Kipshute begashmias. First of all, in a literal sense, that they should come out with great material wealth. Und eich beruchnius der Galus Mitzrayim hat zugegret die Iden als Beitziach Hasam v'gemer tavdenes to the Kimal Harazeh. Also on a spiritual level, there was a great wealth that came after the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, because as the pasuk says, you'll be able to serve the Eibishter on this mountain. So Kenan Mekabels and the Torah, b'matan Torah. That in order for the Yidden to be able to receive the Torah, there had to first be Galus Mitzrayim. So on a material level, on a spiritual level, Galus Mitzrayim was a means to an end. Und der Inyan als Golus ist nicht an Inyan für sich, nur die ganze Kavanah Matara von Golus ist der Rili von was kommt durch der Geule von dem Golus. And this concept that Golus is not a means, is not an end for itself, but it's a means to an end, that it should bring to the revelation and to the greatness that comes after the Golus, which is the Geula. Is going to be by Vayeshev. We see it very openly, very clearly by Vayeshev. Including, as the story goes, in the literal most sense. The fact that Yosef was sold and brought down to Mitzrayim seemed to our perspective, it seemed that it was due to the malintentions of his brothers. But later the truth was revealed. As that I was sent down for sustenance, I should be able to provide for you and save you from the hunger. As Yosef says to his brothers, you didn't send me here, it was the Eibishter that sent me here. So we see very clearly, even in the way the story goes, that it seemed to be a negative thing. Ultimately, it turned out to be a positive thing. And there's actually an emphasis in the Medrash that is consistent with this approach. On the pasuk, Vayeshev hurad Mitzrayim. Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim. Hurad from the word Yerida. So Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim. Says the Medrash Kav Shoin that the word hurad comes from the word to conquer. Hainu matat amrit v'yerid miyamad yam. Like the pasuk says, he will conquer from sea to sea. So we see, which is the word v'yered, which means to conquer. Hurad comes from the word v'yered, that Yosef is conquering Mitzrayim. Or shalat behind the Medrash as another expression, he's ruling it. Hainu heyach ma da'at amrit ki hu reida b'chal ever anar. He is ruling on the other side of the river. So another similar word, shalat, which is to rule, a kavshen, which is to conquer. Either way, the Medrash is saying that hurad doesn't just mean to descend; it means to control. Kavshein und Reida, wird abgelernt von dem Lashon Hurad Mitzrayim. These words are being taken from the word Hurad. The Kavanah, the Torah from the Hirada is, and what the Medrash is teaching us is that the whole purpose and the whole intention of the descent to Mitzrayim, as Yosef Zolver and the Kavish Veshalat, the Yosef should become the conqueror and the ruler. The Mishnah Melech Mitzrayim, the viceroy in Mitzrayim, and other than Yosef, no one can lift a hand or a foot. No one has the power of Yosef. So, in other words, we see Sai in the story the way the Torah tells it to us, and Sai the way the Medrash teaches the word Hurad from the word of Kibush and Shalita, that the purpose of Yosef going down to Mitzrayim was for a greater good, for to be able to sustain his family, more importantly, to be able to conquer Mitzrayim. And the same thing could be said about the arrest and the liberation of Yutes Kislev. It wasn't like there was two separate events. First there was an arrest and then there was a liberation. The redemption was the purpose, was the end goal of the arrest. As the Rebbe Rashab says, even though it's difficult to say so, but the reality is as follows: that this revelation that came after the Alter Rebbe was arrested, was in jail in Peterburg, It's given al derech maimer Chazal is similar to what Chazal tell us, hazayis kishekoichin oisoi moitzi shamnoi, that when you crush the olive, that's where you can extract the oil. But from the moshel is moving a nimshol, and from this metaphor, we understand in the lesson, koichin oisoi is kulim and the chatchilas of the moitzi shamnoi. The whole reason we crush the olive is in order to extract the oil. And as the Rebbe Rashab continues in that Sicha, through all of the negative events that happened in Peterburg, namely the arrest of the Alter Rebbe, the truth, the pnimis, the essence of it became revealed. Which is that the whole purpose of it was to spread Chassidus. And the main purpose of it all was in order to reveal this pnimius, this inner core, inner reason of why this all took place. As it is well known, as nachher das Kislev hat sich angeben, Biker Dinge von Yafutzu, meine Secha Chutza, that it is after Yutis Kislev, where the concept of Yafutzu, meine Secha Chutza, disseminating the wellsprings of Chassidus, began in earnest, began on another level in after Yutis Kislev, which is a slapshus elikus asaga, the ability to bring down godliness into human comprehension. Until Yutis Kislev, the Alter Rebbe would speak very short and very aloof. And after Yutis Kislev, it was brought down into the comprehension of a regular human being. Similarly, with regards to the nations of the world, Yutis Kislev had this effect. The Sarei HaMelucha, referring to the officers of the kingdom, as the Meiser that the arrest of the Alter Rebbe led to the fact that the name of Hashem was exalted and sanctified in the eyes of the officers. And they proclaimed on this whole story, that this happened, this all came from Hashem. And they, the officers of the Russian government, gave permission and authority to the Alter Rebbe to disseminate the teachings of Pnimiyus HaTeirah. So, according to this Siv, the Rebbe is saying the connection between Yutis Kislev and Vayeshev is because just like in Vayeshev, although it's talking about the descent of Yosef into Mitzrayim, but the purpose of the descent was for a greater ascent that followed, namely the fact that Yosef Hurad, that Yosef took over Mitzrayim, Yosef became the ruler of Mitzrayim. So too, by the Alter Rebbe, the purpose of the jailing, of the arrest of the Alter Rebbe, was for the revelation of Chassidus that was going to come after. And you see a very beautiful parallel between Parshas Vayeshev and Yutis Kislev. That's the Rebbe's answer in Siv Beis. And Siv Gimel, the Rebbe is going to ask that it's not so. This answer, as beautiful as it is still not so clear. Because at the end of the day, Vayeshev is talking about the Yerida, the descent into Mitzrayim, and the revelations and the advantages that come later are only reported later in the next parsha, not in Vayeshev. So the Rebbe is asking, where in Vayeshev do we see Geula? And this, the Rebbe is going to take, for that, the Rebbe is going to take us on a journey to understand the concept of Galus and Geula. It's still not clearly understood. Sof is in Parshas Vayeshev. The end of the day, in Parshas Vayeshev, what is actually being discussed is Yosef's descent into Mitzrayim, to the point that Yosef finds himself in jail. And the good and the benefit that is gotten from Yosef's descent to Mitzrayim, is only reported later on in the Parshas HaTeirah. Unlike the Geula, which actually happens at this Kislev. It's not like the Kislev is the beginning of the descent. Yutis Kislev is the end. That's when the redemption happens. And in Vayeshev, we're only discussing the Yerida. And therefore we must conclude that also in our parsha there is a theme of Geula in our parsha as well. Although we don't see it yet, the Rebbe is going to explain to us where we see the idea of Geula in Parshas Vayeshev. So We asked the question, what's the connection to Vayeshev? We suggested that both Vayeshev and Yutas Kislev represent the idea of a Yerida Tzorech Aliyah, but we said it's not good enough because in Vayeshev you only see the Yerida, not the Aliyah, and Yutas Kislev you see the Aliyah. So now we're looking for the Aliyah, for the ascent, for the revelation, the redemption that happens in Vayeshev, and in order to understand this, the Rebbe begins with the following. We first have to understand this medrash that we brought previously, that the word hurad comes from the word kavshain and shalat bohin, of conquering and ruling, controlling. But then, was Razal sagen, that the inyan from kavshain is angedeit in Lashon Vayeshev Hurad Mitzrayim Gufa, from the fact that Chazal tell us that the idea of the conquering of Mitzrayim is indicated in the very word hurad. Is move on as Yosef Yeridel Mitzrayim had nit bloy spete der für zu kavshain. We must therefore say that Yosef's descent into Mitzrayim, it's not just that it ultimately led to a conquering, to a conquest. When he became the viceroy, and then he became the ruler of Mitzrayim. And this was the goal, the purpose of going down to Mitzrayim. That can't be the pshat. The way the Medrash says, the word hurad means kavshain. The word hurad means to conquer. Nachmer, it must beide in Yanim stehen in demselben Wort hurad. Hurad yirida und hurad melashon v'yerd reide shlita. They're both being said in the same word. B'shas is given the Yerida is b'shas ma'ase given vayerd reide kavshain. So therefore, it must be that in the very moment of Hurad, where Yosef is being brought down to Mitzrayim, already there, simultaneously, there is the conquest that Yosef has over Mitzrayim. Although seemingly it's two opposites. Yosef being dragged down to Mitzrayim as a servant, as a slave, as an inmate, seems to be not the idea of kavshain and shalat bain. So the question we have to understand is, where do we see in the Hurad, where in the descent to Mitzrayim, do we see the conquest and the rulership over Mitzrayim? One other detail that has to be brought up. In Medrash Dorten wird noch gebracht noch a Pirush auf Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim. The Medrash brings another explanation on the words Yosef was taken down to Mitzrayim. That Hurad means that not Yosef was taken down, but Yosef took down. Yosef brought down the Shechina with him to Mitzrayim. How do you know that the Shechina went down with Yosef? Because the pasuk says that Hashem was with Yosef. How did Hashem get to be with Yosef? Because he came down with him. So now, in addition to the most literal translation of Hurad, which means to be that Yosef was brought down to Mitzrayim, you have also Hurad from the term V'yerd, Roide, V'shoilet, conquering and ruling, and now you have another pshat, that Yosef brings down the Shechina with him. And since, as we know, all explanations of the same word have some connection amongst themselves, that also this explanation that Yosef brings the Shechina with him down to Mitzrayim also somehow connects to the idea of Yosef's conquest of Mitzrayim in the word Hurad, and we have to understand that connection as well. So in addition to the fact that we have to understand how do you reconcile the fact that Yosef is being dragged down to Mitzrayim, and Yosef is becoming the conqueror of Mitzrayim, which is point number one. Point number two, how does all that reconcile with the fact that Hurad also means that Yosef brought the Shechina down to Mitzrayim with him? So we're trying to understand, where do we find Geula in Parshas Vayeshev in order to connect it to Yutas Kislev? And in order to get there, we ask the question, how do you reconcile Hurad with Roide V'Shoilet? And how do you reconcile Roide V'Shoilet with Hoyrid, the Shechina, that Hashem brought the Shechina down as well, that Yosef brought the Shechina down as well? Siftal, we're going to begin the Biur, and the Rebbe is going to introduce to us three forms of victory. When there is a battle, a struggle, whether it's a person against another person, whether it's a person against his inner midos, whether it's the Jewish people in Galus, and the truth to tell is that the Sikha will sort of journey through various different mishalim to make the same point, but the Rebbe is now going to give us three different levels of Geula. three different manners in how one attains geula. In geula and p'diyah von galus is an veran derayif anim. Okay. The first simplest way is a redemption that comes from a war, from a battle. Very simple. You go to war, you go to fight. You wrestle against the enemy, and you overpower him, and you win. The Rabbi points out, this geula is not a complete geula. Why? For the person has to use his own weaponry. In other words, the person has to, in order to fight the enemy, he has to come up with a way from within himself to fight that enemy. He has to strategize how to battle. To the point that it could be that a lot of blood was spilled. So much so that they have to be close to each other. In order to fight this war, the person has to become close to the enemy, and because of that, he becomes affected by the enemy. He's dragged down by the enemy. He's forced to spill blood. He's forced to use weaponry, etc. To use Hasidic terminology, the victor has to first lower himself into the garments of the enemy that he's fighting, and therefore it drags down even the victor, as the pasuk says, "Kol malbusha yagolti." This is a pasuk that is referring to a prophecy of the Navi, who is talking about the victory that's going to happen when Mashiach comes, and it refers to the fact that the person comes covered in blood. Is my clothes are soiled. Even after the victory, it's incomplete. As bleibt nach der Golti, the clothes remain dirty. In other words, to use a dogma of two people fighting with one another, if one person is fighting with the other person and he's trying to beat them in physically, then what's going to happen is he's going to get hurt. Either he's going to get hurt, either he's going to get dirty. The blood that was spilled might splash on him, on his clothes. So you can't say this person won entirely, because the whole fight dragged him down as well. The second level is what we're going to call a redemption in a way of peace. Der Fall was ein Starkheit ist ad kedekach as nivhalu alufa yadem. The way he wins the war is he's so strong that the generals of Edom, namely the enemy, is afraid of him. In this case, the victor rises above the enemy entirely, and there's no a close combat. Because the way he's winning this war is by rising above him. I'm so strong, I'm so powerful that I rise above, and I just allow the fear of the enemy to stop them from fighting. And to use an example for this in Aveda, so when you're talking about the first level, it would be mitzvahs. We'll be doing mitzvahs. What's the uftu of a mitzvah? That you're elevating the physical thing. What's the downside? That you have to involve yourself in the physical world in order to make tzitzis, in order to make tefillin, whatever you're doing. Most mitzvahs entail the utilization of physical things. And therefore, you're in danger that you're lowering yourself into the physical world. This p'diyah b'shalim is more similar to Teda. Torah does not necessarily, the learning of Torah, the study of Torah, does not necessarily force the person to immerse himself in the world. Like the Chazal say in the pasuk, my words are like fire. Just like fire cannot be mekabel tuma, the divrei Torah cannot become tummy. The words of Torah can never become soiled, can never become impure, because the only way to make something impure is by mixing it with something that is worldly, and the words of Torah don't have to be mixed with worldly matters. So therefore, P'diyah B'Shalom, the example for P'diyah B'Shalom is when the victory comes through the strength of the victor and the fear of the enemy to start up. Says the Rebbe, this too is not a complete geula. Why? The generals of Edom retained their strength and retained their space. In other words, yes, as the Rebbe will explain in the next paragraph, that the person is won because they were afraid to start up, but he didn't vanquish the enemy. Ken sein, as der noch soll sein uleim yematz kishazakam v'chulu. It's possible that at a later time this enemy will strengthen itself and will rise up again. And the Rebbe explains, even though in this case the person's geula is complete, unlike the previous level where the person himself was dragged down into Elam Hazeh, into the dirt. Here, the person's geula is complete because the enemy is afraid to start up with him. That it's only because to the person there's no room for galus. But if you went down to where galus actually is, there was no geula. So on the first level, the enemy is vanquished, but the person was dragged down because of it. In the second level, the person was not dragged down, but the enemy was not vanquished. And now we come to the third eifin. The hechster eifin is. That even in a case where the victor has to lower himself down to where the enemy is, and in the nimshul, the yid has to go down into galus. Not only does the galus not make him dirty, which would be a real descent, on this level, what happens is the galus is transformed into a state of geula. For example, if you were to use the example of two people that are fighting, in the first case he beats him. In the second case he just ignores him. In the third case he befriends him. So he doesn't get dirty because there's no blood being spilled, but the enemy is vanquished, not in a way of being destroyed, but in a way of being transformed. And in that case, it is a complete galus because there's no room anymore for an enemy. The enemy is gone. There's no opposition because the menagid, the enemy, was transformed into a friend. Und das ist der Pyrus in Pasuk Padav Shalom Nafshi Mikravli. As Chosh, as a matzah from Mikravli, from Milchama was kommt von his lapsus and galus. This is what you say B'Shalom, but Mikravli. That even though it's Mikrav, it is in a way where you're close to the enemy. You had to immerse yourself into the galus. Von deswegen is the P'di and from the Shalom. Nevertheless, the outcome is a peaceful one because rather than fight the enemy, we transform the enemy. How is this possible? If this menagid is a menagid, so how are you going to befriend the menagid? So the Rebbe says, because this pedia comes from a place that transcends galus. And therefore, the galus could become geula. If you go back to the source of it, the fact that there's galus versus geula is in our perspective. Where we are in this world, there are things that translate into galus, and when those things are taken away, then that becomes geula. Or as the Rebbe says in the Hara, that when you take the aleph of Elokus and you put it into the word geula, becomes geula. But if you go to a place where it's higher than galus and geula, then then you could add that aleph, and the galus could become geula. It's possible, but you have to reach the very high level that is higher than galus. So just to summarize quickly, we're on the mission to understand what is. Where do you see geula in Parshas Vayeshev? So we start out by understanding first what's geula. How does geula look? What does geula look like? So, or Padiyah. What does Padiyah look like? What does redemption look like? So there's one where there's a Milchama and the enemy is vanquished, but it drags the person down. There's somewhere else where the person rises above, but the enemy is not vanquished. And then you have a third level where the enemy is transformed into a friend, where Galus is transformed into Geula. This is step number 1 of the beer. In Sifnei Hey, the Rebbe will continue to step number 2 of this beer by applying these 3 levels to the Shvatim, to the Avos, and to Yosef HaTzadik. Sifnei. The drei Yifanim anal in Gula are eich passing to the drei Yifanim Avei, the Shvatim, Avos, Yosef. Die Schwatten sind wenn jetzt sehen, wie es Bededus, Yesem Basada, moved from Welt. The Shvatim were shepherds. They lived isolated from the world, in the field, removed from the world, so that way worldly matters should not distract them from their connection to Elokus. The Rebbe is saying here that the Shvatim fit into the first category. Now, in the end, the Shvatim never went to war. They ran away. But had they gone to war, then they would have gotten dirty. What does dirty mean? That it would have affected their connection to Elokus. And therefore they never went to war. But because of the Shvatim, we'll see in a second, but because of where the Shvatim are holding, because of that, if they were to fight, which means to say, if they were to be mislabish in Galus, in order to change the Galus, what would happen to them would be that it would affect their dveikus, their connection to Elokus, which is why in the end they don't go to war at all. I just want to clarify that one more time. In the end, it's hard to see the connection here because they didn't go to war. But what the Rebbe is learning from is from the fact that they didn't go to war shows that had they gone to war, they would have gotten dirty, which is the first oifen. There would have been a padiyah, but it would have been b'derech milchama, and it would have dragged them down. The Rebbe explains this b'pnimi sanyanim in the vernacular of Chassidus. The level of the Shvatim is the lower Merkava. You know, Merkava represents Bittul, which is Atzilus. Usually we say the other side of the Merkava, that is in the world of Atzilus. In the world of Atzilus, the world is not Teifes Makim. The world that does not have any significance. And therefore the Bittul is complete. We'll get to that in a moment. The Shvatim are referred to as Merkavta Tata, the lower level of Merkava, which means there is a sense of Bittul, but the world, creation, carries some significance. Had the Shvatim gone down to involve themselves in worldly matters, it would have affected their ability to remain, to cleave to godliness on the level of Merkava. Because since they're working in the world, and the world is not entirely batal to Elokus in the level of Bria, therefore, that involvement in the world would have dragged them down from their dveikus be'elokus. And that's why the Shvatim actually didn't go to war. But had they gone to war, it would have been b'derech milchama, which means it would have dragged them down. It would have negatively affected their dveikus be'elokus, their ability to connect to the Eibishter, because the worldliness that they would be involved in would be a distraction. B'dargis ha'avis, merkavta ilah. Conversely, when talking about the avos, which they are the higher level of Merkava, which is Atzilus, is afilu gefinnen sich dik in Welt, seien sie nicht die Slapshus ba'olam. It's very important to line over here because the word Slapshus is a very important word. The avos, because they are operating on the level of Atzilus, so Welt is not Teifes Makim, which means they could be in the world, and the world does not distract them from their dveikus be'elokus. So as long as they're not slabshus ba'olam, if they're in the world but not immersed in the world, so therefore they could be in the world and it won't affect their connection to Hashem. So the obvious, like Avram went down to Mitzrayim and Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, the obvious could be in Welt, not be slabshus, but in Welt. And because they're on the level of a Merkava, that they're totally bottled to the Eibishter, like in the Darga of Atzilus, therefore their being in the Welt does not affect their connection to the Eibishter. Which is similar to Padiyah B'derech Shalom, which means they rise above Welt. They're in the Welt, which means they're engaging with Welt, but they're b'derech shalom. The Welt is afraid, so to speak. The Welt does not start up with them, so their dveikus be'elokus remains complete. Although, as we said earlier, Welt doesn't get changed because they weren't mislabish ba'olam. So the Welt remains as it is, but it's still a padiyah because their dveikus be'elokus remains intact. Hecher, therefore, is dargas aveta von Yosef higher than these two levels, the level of Yosef. On the one hand, not only was Yosef gefintzach, in Welt, not only is Yosef present in the space of the world, but Yosef is bislapshus binyanei ha'olam. Keep in mind, you can't change the world without islapshus. So the avos are not affecting the world like Yosef. But Yosef goes bislapshus, and the Rabbi gives examples. But in general, the fact that he was in Mitzrayim was a great bother, was a great difficulty for him, a great and intense difficulty. Certainly when Yosef becomes a king over Mitzrayim, where he was running the entire country, no one can do anything without him. Especially later in the story, where Yosef becomes the one that is handing out the grain to all of the people. That Yosef was engaged with literally the entire world. Every mitzvah, every person was coming for a handout of some tvuah. So we see Yosef is not just in the world; he's bislapshus. When Azay says by him given ich frier von sind ihre das in Mitzrayim, the same thing is true really even before he becomes the viceroy, before he becomes before he gains power. As soon as he arrives to Mitzrayim, first of all, Zayin dekanevet by Potiphar, Sarat Tabachim, is a grantor in the Asang from Potiphar. Number one, as a servant of Potiphar, he was involved in Potiphar's matters. Potiphar's businesses. And also after that, when he becomes jailed in the prison, that the warden gave Yosef all of the inmates that were there. That's called Asher Oisim Sham. And everything that had to be done in the jail, Yosef was doing. Clearly, again, he was, in the most literal sense, involved, immersed in worldly matters. So Yosef, whether it's in Potiphar's house, whether it's in jail, whether it's as the viceroy of Mitzrayim, whether it's as the food czar, handing out the food that was saved to be able to feed the Mitzrayim, in all of these cases, he's bislapshus, he's immersed in worldly matters. And nevertheless, all of these distractions did not distract him from his connection to the Eibishter. In the very moment where he is involved, he's a total merkava, a total chariot, in a state of total bittul to the Eibishter. This is Yosef, this is the Ufta of the third way. That even while he's engaged with the physical world in a way of islapshus, in that very same moment, he's a merkava telekus, which is that's beyond our comprehension, as we'll soon see. It's a darga of Yosef that's lav dafka darga that we can reach. But that is the reality, that on the level of Yosef, it's possible to simultaneously be melubash, be in yonei ha'olam, and at the same time to be a merkava telekus. Because by Yosef, the godly light that shined upon him was entirely removed from the world. You can't even say that the world is insignificant. In other words, by the obvious, we said the world it doesn't exist. It's as if the world doesn't exist. To say that here is not true, because you're still acknowledging the existence of a world. To say that by Yosef world is not Tefes Makim means the world is still something that is not Tefes Makim. By Yosef at such a high level, you can't even say that the world is not significant. Because this level is so far removed from the world, therefore you could serve Hashem while being in the world in a manner of islapshus, and it does not affect the dveikus, the connection, the oneness with Hashem. The dveikus this dveikus to Hashem could be experienced, could be felt, even in the worldly matters in which he is invested. That in the world itself, one can experience, one can internalize a likus that's higher than the world. You have here what you might call nimna nimnois. What you have here is something that is a total incongruity. You're in the Welt and you're experiencing a likus that's higher than Welt. That's Yosef. And that's why Yosef could be in Melubash, in Yonei Elam Hazeh, and at the same time, he's a Merkava Mamash Lelikus. And the Rebbe brings the raya from the Psukim. This is how it was by Yosef. Azayin dikanevi b'petifar is vayar adeinav ki Hashem itay v'chol asher esu hu Hashem asliach b'yodei, that his master saw that Hashem is with him, and everything he does, Hashem brings him success. In them artful Potiphar is adeinav, in the very space where Potiphar is the master. Dorten kufa the zelber adeinav gizan ki Hashem itay. In that very same space, the master recognizes that the Eibishter is with him. Which again, the Rebbe is showing the stira, the incongruity that is happening here. That on the one hand, who's the boss? Potiphar, not the Eibishter. Potiphar. And Potiphar, as the boss of Yosef, recognizes that Hashem itay, that Yosef is a merkava lelakus. Und noch sein an Aser bei Saseir is Vayi Hashem es Yosef, Vayetel of Chesed, Vayitnchine be'enis ar bei Saseir, that the Eibishter was with Yosef, and the Eibishter extended kindness to him, and he found grace in the eyes of the warden of the prison. The warden of the prison, where Yosef is an Aser, where Yosef is an inmate, he recognizes that Vayi Hashem es Yosef, that Yosef is a Merkava Lelakus. So the Uftu of these last two Sifim, Sif Dalit and Hey, where the Rebbe explains that there's three dargis in Pediya, and the third dargah in Pediya is where on the one hand, you're engaging with the enemy, and on the other hand, you're transforming the enemy. You're not getting dirty or soiled or affected negatively because you're transforming the enemy. And the way it was by Yosef was, on the one hand, Yosef, unlike the Aves and the other Shvatim, was Yosef was bislapshus in Yonei Olam, and at the same time, it did not affect in any way, shape, or form his being a Merkava Lelakus. This stira, this is how we're going to teach the Yosef Hurad. You remember, we asked earlier, Hurad means to go down to Mitzrayim. And then we also said the Hurad means to conquer Mitzrayim. How do you have in the same word two things that seem to be the opposite? But now it's going to make perfect sense, because the whole Yosef's whole journey into Mitzrayim is something that doesn't make sense. It's two opposites that are operating simultaneously. Was der Medrash sagt, auf Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim, Kovshin, v'yerd mi yom ad yom, und die Sheiches von dem Inus von Pirush von Hurad, here das Shechina imay. Now we'll understand what the Medrash says on Vayeshev Hurad, that it means Kavshain, that Yosef conquered Mitzrayim, and the fact that the Medrash says that Yosef brought the Shechina down to Mitzrayim with him. First, damit was Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim kipshute, und euch beruchen ist. Bei ihm ist given die Rede und es Lapsus in Mitzrayim. And Yosef goes down, the literal meaning of Hurad means he goes down to Mitzrayim, which also was a ruchnistic yerida, because Yosef had to go down and be mislabish, immerse himself, invest himself in Mitzrayim. Is there geblieben b'mehusay alikis hoyre des Shechina imay. He retained his godly existence. And that's what it means. He took the Shechina with him. Vahi Hashem es Yosef. That Yosef, despite the fact that he was Hurad, that he descended into a space of Welt in a manner of Islabshus, nevertheless he retains his godly existence. And that's what it means. He took the Shechina with him. Mit der Yeride Gufe hat sich aufgetan der Kafshain. And then, after we understand that Yosef is going down to Mitzrayim, but Yosef is retaining his Elokus, because of that, or together with that, this accomplishes a kavsha in a conquest. But when Yosef comes in Mitzrayim, he does guf and machtir in Mitzrayim. The very arrival of Yosef in Mitzrayim, this already transforms Mitzrayim. Because in the mokim from Mitzrayim, in the very space of Mitzrayim, one can acknowledge, one can feel Elokus. And this happens right at the very beginning of the descent. His master saw right in the beginning that the Eibishter is with him. And therefore he put him in charge of the house and gave him control. Because he saw that Yosef is with the Eibishter is with Yosef. That Yosef is a Merkava Telakus. Similarly, when he went down to the jail, the same thing. Even though it's still in the place of Yerida, he didn't yet get to the ultimate Gilui and Ilui that was going to come from Mitzrayim. But in the place of the Yerida, Dahi Hashem es Yosef, he's a Merkava Telakus, and therefore he transforms Mitzrayim. He conquers Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim recognizes the fact that in Mitzrayim there's a Lakus. In other words, Teirish Shebal Peh, the Medrash that tells us Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim, Kavshein, the Teirish Shebal Peh is Megal is revealing to us. As the Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim is Pirushe V'Inyane, the meaning of Yosef going down to Mitzrayim is Kavshein, Madat Amrit, V'Yered Miyom, that it means to conquer, as the pasuk says, V'Yered Miyom Ad Yom. So what we've done is we've now gained a brand new understanding in what is the very Yerida of Yosef to Mitzrayim. What's happening? It's not just like we thought in the beginning of the Sikha, that Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim for the purpose of later on feeding the brothers, or conquering Mitzrayim, or bringing the Yidden to Har Sinai. But the vart is that Yosef represents the idea of Pediyah in a way where you transform the enemy, and it happens b'chadamachta. While you're melubish in the world, you're also at the very same time merkavat elikus. That's Yosef. And therefore, when Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim, number one, he retains his mitzias, his mehusaya lekis, his godly mitzias, which means the Eibishter comes with him. And because of that, he conquers Mitzrayim. He becomes the ruler of Mitzrayim. The lashon is hurad kavshein v'yed b'yamad yom. So we answered our questions that we had with regards to the Medrashim on the word Hurad, because it's not different things. It all has to be in the same word. It's all happening at the same time. In the very same time that Yosef is descending into Mitzrayim, he's being mislabish in Welt. At the same time, the Shekhinah is coming with him, which means that he doesn't become devoid of his godly existence. And because of that, at the very same time, Yosef's very descent into Mitzrayim is a conquest of Mitzrayim. Now the Rebbe will go back to the Alter Rebbe. Me'ein says, given by Meister Gula from Alter Rebbe. Similarly, we see by the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is given by Beis Asurim, Bislapsus, and Golos. When the Alter Rebbe was in jail, he was totally immersed in exile. He did not sweeten the judgment by passing his hand over his forehead, like Reb Baruch Meshibuzer, who was an Einikul of the Baal Shem Tov, said to the Alter Rebbe, why are you going through this? With one passing of the hand over the forehead, you could have ended this whole thing. And as the Alter Rebbe said to him, that the Alter Rebbe wanted it to go through the process of the physical world. But the point is that Alter Rebbe didn't just pass his hand over his forehead and go out of Golos. He didn't have the jail, the name of the jail was Taina Savet. He didn't have the jail burned down. And the way that he was dealt with was that they interrogated him. And you say this from Torah and Mitzvahs, many questions in the fundamentals of Torah and Mitzvahs, which he explained in an elaborate way. That even the very materialistic minds of the interrogators should be able to understand. This is not called, rising above. The Alter Rebbe going into jail and being there for all the days that he was there and being interrogated and having to deal with all of these interrogators and officers meant that he was bihislapshus in Golos. He actually was immersed in the Golos. On the other hand, is the Alter Rebbe nit v'muchnichem. The Alter Rebbe was not forced to go through this process. As the Frierdiker Rebbe related, the whole jailing, the whole arrest, was with the agreement of the Alter Rebbe. When the Rebbe would ask him again, had the Alter Rebbe not agreed, they would not have been able to catch him and arrest him. The raya of them is from the Nesilah Peterburg. It's a very clear and beautiful proof from the actual journey to Peterburg to the jail. His Freitag geblieben stehen, die Schweizer Bedel. The black wagon remained standing on Friday, it couldn't move. Und es hat nicht geholfen, die 4 Pferd, was man zugespannt, and the 4 horses that were harnessed did not help after schleppen den Wagen to pull the wagon. They couldn't move. They couldn't budge. Because the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe did gewollt, because the Alter Rebbe didn't want to go. So we see from this that the Alter Rebbe, if the Alter Rebbe didn't want to go, he didn't go. So the fact that he went is because the Alter Rebbe agreed. Der klolis inyan von der Tfisa, idas via halboshe berotzen, shaloi li shtamas berach l'mayla benateva. The whole idea of the arrest was the fact that the Alter Rebbe willingly immersed himself into the jail so as not to have to depend on a supranatural means. Alter Rebbe Dafka wanted to go through nature. When it says Yodua, and it is well known in Chassidus, as if a person immerses themselves or confines themselves willingly to something, that is not considered a true confinement. True confinement means that it came from an outside source and it was forced upon him. But if the person himself is confining himself, so that person is part of the confinement. So it's not considered a total confinement. I chose to confine myself. So there's still a me here. I'm not totally lost and bottled to the jailer. So the fact that the Alter Rebbe chose to go to jail, it shows that despite the fact that he was bislapsus in the jail, nevertheless he remained balabas. He was in control all along. The fact that by the Alter Rebbe there could have been these two extremes. On the one hand, he was in jail, bislapsus, he was being interrogated by people, and it seemed as if he was stuck there. And on the other hand, it was with his rishus, with his haskama, with his agreement. So which shows that he wasn't really truly confined. So which one is it? It's both. How can both be? His movement understood from the words of the Rabbeim. The Alter Rebbe is atzmi. Atzmi is nitshayach in shinus manumakim. The Alter Rebbe is an atzmi. The Alter Rebbe was on the level of the essence of the core of the person, and therefore, what the external circumstances cannot change the etzem. The etzem is something that is so essential that it doesn't get affected by external circumstances. Like, for example, if you have something that's painted, so the paint is something external. But if it's not painted, if it's the natural color of it, then you could beat it, you could break it, you could do whatever you want to it, the color won't change. Because the natural color is the essential color. So what does it have to do with the Alter Rebbe? The Alter Rebbe on the level of etzem, anything is possible. On the level of etzem, even though two things contradict with each other, and later on there'll seem to be a contradiction, but when you go back to the core of it, it's not a contradiction, because what happens later is external, and external things that happen to it affect only the externalities, but the etzem itself never gets affected. And therefore the Alter Rebbe, even though he was in jail, the Alter Rebbe was able, while being in jail, to impact the officers that they should free him, that they should recognize that he is a godly person. So in other words, we're still in the middle here, but let's compare it to Yosef. Number one, Yosef was Hurad Mitzrayim. So to the Alter Rebbe was bislapsus in the jail. At the same time, the Alter Rebbe went there with his own haskama. And because of that, they recognized that he was an Isha Liki. Vahi Hashem Itoy. Just like the officers recognized that the Alter Rebbe is an Isha Liki. But there's more than that. Und das ist, was der Alter Rebbe ist, Meirech Bigrase Ayudua, wegen sein Geula. And the Alter Rebbe then elaborates in his letter, Hifli Hashem v'higdi lases b'eretz, asher nisgadol v'niskadish b'rabim, ubifrat b'einik kol asarim v'chalamesh b'chomedinis HaMelech, that Eibishter did this incredible greatness, that the Eibishter's name was sanctified and exalted, especially in the eyes of the officers and the nations. In all of the lands of the king. They were totally taken by it. And they proclaimed that this is from Hashem. That under their rulership, they recognized, the officers and the king himself, that the Alter Rebbe is a wise person and a godly person. Und das, als sie aber anerkennt, as meis Hashem hoyso zeis, drikt uis der Ufte von der Gule von this Kislev. This recognition, that they recognize that the Alter Rebbe is a Isha Liki, and that this entire event of the jailing is meis Hashem hoyso zeis. This is, and therefore they gave rishus that to the Alter Rebbe to continue to teach Chassidus. That is Yutas Kislev. Just like by Yosef, that the very descent was in a way that he was in control, so too the Alter Rebbe was always in control. He was taking a descent, he was in Mitzrayim, because he had to, for the Zayis, there had to be a crushing of the olive, so the Alter Rebbe had to go down into jail, but at the very same time, the Alter Rebbe was always in control. Just like Kovshain, just like Yosef was in control of Mitzrayim. So this answers the question, what's the connection between Vayeshev and Yutis Kislev? Because Emes Take talks about the Hurad, but the Hurad itself is Vayerd. The Hurad that Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim is the control that Yosef takes, the conquest that Yosef has over Mitzrayim. And that is the parallel with Yutis Kislev, that the Alter Rebbe goes down into jail, and at the same time, the Goyim recognized, Me'ez Hashem oiso zeis, that this is from Hashem, and they gave the permission to continue to teach and to spread the teachings of Teres Achsidis. That is Yutis Kislev. So it's very clear the connection between Vayeshev and Yutis Kislev. Both are discussing a scenario where there is what we would call two opposites operating simultaneously. On the one hand, there is a descent, and at the same time, this descent is actually the greatest ascent, the greatest conquest and control over Welt, over Mitzrayim, over the Russian government, and over the Menagdim, the enemies of Teres Achsidis. But we've asked and answered the question. In the rest of the Sikha till the Hira, the Rebbe is going to show how this idea of these two opposites, where on the one hand, you're dealing with a slapshus in Welt, and on the other hand, you're dealing with a being so much higher than Welt that the slapshus in Welt doesn't affect the dveikus be'elokus, the adarabah, it's able to transform Welt, is actually could be found in the Torah of the Baal Shem, in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe, in the Tanya. Ches. Everything is revealed through the light of Torah. This accomplishment that happened through the arrest and the liberation of the Alter Rebbe must be connected with a chiddush, with a novelty in the teachings of the Alter Rebbe's Torah. And certainly we must find this in Tanya. Because Kedua is the Gula von Yutis Kislev given in Schus von the 2 Jahr Chayes B'Teira V'Aveda, was der Tanya hat Meisik and Zwischen Chassidim, as we know from the Sichos. I believe this is said by the Tzemach Tzedek, that the Geula of Yutis Kislev was in the merit of the 2 years of the extra energy and chayes that was added on to the learning in Aveda because of the Tanya. Which is why the Alter Rebbe wanted the Tanya to be printed before Yutis Kislev. So that way, during the time of after the Tanya is printed, it could be used as a schos for the Alter Rebbe. Va'abir. So let's see where in the Alter Rebbe's Tanya are we going to find an explanation for this chiddush that we just learned about the Alter Rebbe's arrest and liberation, that in the very Yerida to jail, there was a sense of kavshain, there was a sense of ownership and control over the world that ultimately led to the world recognizing the importance of the Alter Rebbe and Teres Achsidis. So the Rebbe says like this, in the Sefer Tanya Kadisha, the way Tanya is laid out for us, in our version, Kum der Shara Yichud V'Amuna al Tzveit Chelik, the Shara Yichud V'Amuna is the second section of the Tanya. So we do have Mitzil Chasidim, it is known, and the Chasidim told it over, and when Alten Rebbe is given, Akosal Kadaitoch, at first, the Alter Rebbe had a thought that Shara Yichud V'Amuna should be the first section of Tanya, before Likutei Amarim. Was mir high time gefunden in Chinuch Katan, and because of that, in the Chinuch Katan, the Akdama to Shara Yichud V'Amuna, which is the introduction to Shara Yichud V'Amuna, we find Beis Gimel Pa'amim 2 or 3 times the Mlashon K'moshe Yizboyer B'Lashon Asid, the expression as will be explained in the future tense. Even though the Alter Rebbe is referring to things that he already explained in part 1, which is Likutei Amarim, but since at one point Likutei Amarim was going to come second, therefore the Alter Rebbe wrote K'moshe Yizboyer, as will be explained in the future. So we see that we see not just from the stories of Chassidim, but we see that actually the Alter Rebbe had a thought that Shara Yichud V'Amuna should come first. Nachmer, since the Alter Rebbe didn't then go and correct the words to Nizboer in the past tense, This proves, as a filo nach dem, that Alter Rebbe hat Machle given. As the Shariuchot V'Amunah will come nach dem Chedek Kedushin. Then even after the Alter Rebbe made the decision, the Shariuchot V'Amunah should come second. Hat Ibergelost and the Sinnes Makim to Svara Akademis, he still left space, still left a thought that the original way is the right way. When the Shariuchot V'Amunah hat an Inya v'steht frier, aber nit berei v'inyanim. And there are certain elements in Shariuchot V'Amunah which belong first, even though most of it was ultimately came second. But there is an element of Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah that really belongs to be first. And the Rebbe explains this in the next paragraph. The Seder von Avodas Adam is the order in which a person does his avodah, as b'chtei tzutzukum and tz'ava v'yira, in order to reach the levels of ava v'yira, v'das is the teichen from Chelek Rishon Shebetanya, which is the theme of the first Perek of Tanya. First, it has to be this true and trusting faith in the oneness of the Eibishter, which is the theme of Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah, as the Alter Rebbe says at the end of Chinuch Katan. In other words, the way it works, first you need Amunah, then comes Ava V'Yira. So Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah is about Amunah. Likutei Amarim is about Ava V'Yira. So really, Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah has an element of it that Taka belongs to be first. So the Rebbe is saying is that Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah there was a thought to put it first. Even now that it's second, the Alter Rebbe clearly alludes in the Tanya that there is part of it that is meant, that there is an element of it that belongs to be first, and actually that makes sense because Amunah comes first, and therefore, so therefore we could say that if we're going to look to find the theme of the Alter Rebbe's arrest and liberation in Tanya, we're going to find it in Sha'ar HaYichud V'Amunah. Siftas, and now the Rebbe begins to delve into some of the fundamental ideas of Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah, and the Rebbe is going to explain how that sheds light on this Chiddush in the Meiser and Geula, the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe. So just so we understand, we already answered the question. What's the connection between Vayeshev and Yotas Kislev? In both, we're talking about an incongruity of a Yerida happening at the same time as taking control of the situation. And now we're finding that concept in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe, specifically in Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah, which in a certain element comes first. Zwischen die und Yonim, was man der Alter Rebbe ist, mit Varim Achadus und Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah, sind da alle Cheder, zwei Kolos, die Kudus. Amongst the various principles, fundamental ideas that the Alter Rebbe explains in Shaychut V'Amunah, L'cha'oira, and the Rebbe says in the Ara that sometimes L'cha'oira means that's not just L'cha'oira, which means seemingly, but it's actually that way. There are two general ideas. Aleph, the Biur and Pirush of Baal Shem Tov of Le'elam Hashem Dorach Nitzvah Hashemayim. The Alter Rebbe explains the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov on the words, on the pasuk, your words, Hashem, are forever standing in the heavens. Baal Shem Tov says, as Dvarcha Shamarta Yirakia, those words that you said, let there be a heaven. Tevis v'oisies elo, these words, these letters, are constantly standing within the heavens, to sustain them. If the letters would disappear for one instant, and we go back to their source, you call Hashamayim ayin ve'efes mamish v'hoyu k'lo hoyu klal. Then the entire heaven would cease to exist as if it never existed. As if it was before the 6 weeks, the 6 days of creation. That's what the Baal Shem Tov says. Was the Funis verstandig? So the Alter Rebbe learns from this. That every single creation, every single existence is really ayin ve'efes, is really nothing in comparison to the energy from the Eibishter that is coming down into the created being to continuously create it and to continuously bring it from a state of ayin, of nothingness, to yesh, to something. So that's the first part of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe will explain it soon, but the Alter Rebbe is saying is not only is the Eibishter saying Yehida Kia at all times, but the words of the Yehida Kia are constantly in the created being, and therefore the created being is in a state of total bittul, because it realizes that if not for these words Yehida Kia, or whatever item it is that's being sustained, it would cease to exist. In other words, the theme is to recognize Einid Milvado. The theme is to recognize the oneness of Hashem and how everything is batal. And we'll see this later on in the Sikha. If the Eibishter said Yehidakia and walked away, and then it was the Yehidakia came into being and was existing on its own, then the bittul can be so strong because he doesn't realize his total dependency on the Eibishter. But if the Eibishter is saying Yehidakia at every single moment, then his dependencies on the Eibishter is so much greater, and therefore the bittul is so much greater. And if it's not just that the Eibishter is saying Yehidakia, but those words are actually become part of the Nivra, and the Nivra doesn't exist without it, then the Nivra's bittul is that much stronger, because it realizes that its entire existence is the Dvar Elokei that's sustaining it. That's one idea that the Alter Rebbe discusses in Shayuchot V'Munah at length, explaining the Shita of the Baal Shem Tov. Beis, another idea, Ader Tzimtzum is nit kipshute. That when we discuss in Kabbalah the idea of a tzimtzum, that the Eibishter contracted himself in order to create a world, it does not mean in the literal sense. That the Eibishter removed his entire being from this world, and is just supervising from above on all of his creations. That is not the case. The Alter Rebbe holds that the tzimtzum is not kipshute. The tzimtzum means we might feel like it's tzimtzum. It might feel like the Eibishter removed his existence, so that way there should be room for Elamis, or be room for creation. But in truth, the Eibishter is always there. The entire etzem, the entire essence of godliness is always there, and it was never really truly contracted from wherever it was. So these are the two ideas that are discussed, two of the klalos tikkun that are discussed in Shayuchot V'Emunah. As the biur inyan as simts wenig kipsute is nit aber zunder inyan. Das kommt beim Hemstich und ist shaykh zum biur chindish aber santer kidla kaman. The Rebbe in Sifil is now going to explain that these two things are not two separate independent ideas. Number one, we should know that the Eibishter is Mahav Machayim Kaim the world at all times, and the words of the Asar Mamores are the essence of every single creation. That's one idea. Another idea, Tzimtzum is not kipsute. That says the Rebbe it's not two separate ideas. These two ideas are actually intertwined, and the Rebbe will explain that in Seif Yud. The Chiddush in Pirush Baal Shem Tov is nicht nur as a Dvar Havaya muss ständig mahave sein jeder Nivra. So, and as we were saying before, the Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov is not that the words of Hashem have to constantly recreate or recreate every creation. B'chol rega v'rega. Nor, oich, as the Tevis, Yirakia Gamer, these words, Yirakia, or whatever words it is that are bringing this existence into being, are enclosed, are inserted into each of these heavens for eternity, to keep them alive, to sustain them. And same is true with any creation. It's not just that it's constantly happening. The Eibishter is saying and it's becoming into being, but that these words are melubash. They are inserted into, become part of the essence of the created being. As the Alter Rebbe explains, that every single creation has a spiritual soul, a spiritual existence. Even those things that were not mentioned in the Asar Mamoris, they still receive a chayis that trickles down from the original Asar Mamoris by shuffling some of the letters, by changing some of the letters, by using gematria. So if you have something that was not part of the Asar Amaris, where they just said certain things should be created, but since then there's many other things that exist in this world, even they are using the Asar Amaris in a trickle-down form, which is a greater tzimtzum, in order for them to have those words of the Asar Amaris mitzumtzum and melubash into that nivra prati. So in the brackets, the Rebbe is adding that it's not just the main items that are mentioned in the Asar Amaris, but every single creation has in it letters and words of the Eibishter that are melubash in them, that are inserted inside of them, become the essence of that nivra, and that is what keeps it alive. Das heißt, es ist nicht der Pshat, dass der Dvaravaya ständig mahavet dem Nivra und der Nivra wird nifrit von der Dvaravaya. Doesn't mean that the words of Hashem are constantly recreating the Nivra, and then the Nivra becomes separated from the Dvaravaya. No, the Dvaravaya is melubish in dem Nivra gufa, in dem Ort von dem Nivra. The words of Hashem are inserted into the Nivra down in the world where the Nivra exists. Because the chayis v'nefesh von yadam Nivra prati, idos the dvaravai v'sim. And the sustenance, the life force of every single creation is the words of Hashem that are inserted into it. And therefore it's clear that every single creation is considered as nothing in comparison to the power of the Eibishter's, the energy of the Eibishter's creation and the words, the breath of the mouth of Hashem that is in the created being. That's constantly recreating it and bringing it from ayin into yesh. So here the Rebbe, the Sikha explains the first thing into the Baal Shem Tov. What's the Baal Shem Tov saying? The Baal Shem Tov is saying not only is the Eibishter constantly sustaining it, but the sustaining words become part of the created being, to the point that the whole chayis, the whole existence of the created being is the Dvaravaya. Which understandable now. The Nivra, the level of bittul that the Nivra has is k'ayin efes mamish. If not only if he needs to constantly rely on a Dvaravaya, but more than that, the Dvaravaya is his essence, is what gives him the chayis. It's part of him. Of it, I should say. So then, in that case, the person, the Nivra, is so entirely and totally dependent on the Eibishter, on the Elokus, on the Dvaravaya, that the bittul is almost complete. I say almost because of what's going to happen in the next paragraph. In other words, until now, the Rebbe said the bittul is total, complete, because the dependence of the Nivra on the Boira is in ganzen. And that was the first nekuda of Shari Yichud Ve'emunah. The chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov. But based on all of this, says the Rebbe, there's a problem. As the bittul from the Nivra is need, kein bittul b'shlem Moshe, that the bittul is incomplete. Why? But on vibal, as der chayis was sich mislabish Nivroim, is a chayis mit zum umugbolet Nivra canal. Since the chayis that is coming into this Nivra is tailor-made for the Nivra, the whole chiddush is that it's a dvaravaya that is mitzumtzum lefi erech the Nivra and becomes part of the Nivra. So that means that the parameters of this chayis is based on the Nivra. Is a doch nesen mokken mitzias hayesh. So the fact that the chayis is being misamtzim himself to this nivra, that means it's giving significance to the nivra. And therefore the bittul is not complete. Because if the whole chayis is based on the parameters of the nivra, then the nivra is a mitzias. And if the nivra is a mitzias, the bittul is lacking. In other words, until now we were saying that the dependence of the nivra on the beira is so complete that therefore the bittul is full, is total. But the problem now, he says the Rebbe, that if that's the case, what about the fact that the chayis is mugbal and mugbal lefi this nivra? That means that we are being machshiv. We are taking this nivra into consideration. Which as soon as the nivra becomes it's taken into consideration, already we're recognizing mitzias. If we're recognizing mitzias, then there's a lack of bittul. Later, but now that we understand that the other nekuda that the Alter Rebbe teaches is Tzimtzum is not kipshutei. The hainu as eich in the mokim madregi was the erev chayis eliki zich mesamsum meslamis with the chan nivroim is less asar ponim minei, that even in the place where the erev chayis eliki that's sustaining the nivra has so contracted itself and so become part of the nivra, at the same time is less asar ponim minei. There is no space that is devoid of elokus. And the essence of Hashem fills the world, bismanu mokim in time and space. So now that the Alter Rebbe says that you have tzimtzum is not kipshute, which means that the etzem of Hashem still remains, that on the one hand, you have a chayis prati that goes into the nivra, that is take, mitzumtzum lefi erech the nivra, and because of that it becomes one in part with the nivra, which is why the bittul is so strong. But even though there's a little piece missing of that bittul because it's being machshiv the nivra, there is another chayis. There's another dargin elokus, the etzem of elokus, that is totally not mitzumtzum, that is also present in that space as well. Now you have two extremes. Jeder Nivra hat sein Nefesh v'chayis ruchnis pratis, was kommt durch der Zimtzum und es lapsus und es war dabei jeder Nivra prati. That on the one hand, every Nivra, every creation has its individual, tailor-made chayis that comes through Tzimtzum and through the lapsus of the Dvar Hashem into that specific Nivra. But at the same time, every Nivra also has a connection to the essence of Hashem. Weil in dem Ort von dem Nivra, because wherever the Nivra is, the Eibishter is there as well, because Tzimtzum was not Kipsutei. There was no actual Tzimtzum. And since the essence of Hashem is totally removed from the world, so then one can appreciate, one can recognize, one can acknowledge that the very essence of the world is a lakus. As it said in Chassidus, that the created yesh is the ultimate yesh, which means to say, usually we say, you have yesh amiti is the Eibishter, and you have yesh anivra, which is the created being. Usually the created being is the material, and the yesh amiti is the Eibishter. But the expression is, yesh anivra is yesh amiti, because the created being is actually is actually created by the Yesha Amiti. And since there was no Tzimtzum Kipsutei, so therefore the Yesha Amiti is there in its entirety. And therefore, Einid Movadei. And therefore, even that little bit of the bittul that's missing, because the Chayis Prati recognized the individual Nivra, but that gets covered with the fact that the whole Atzmus Umuhus is in that same place as well. So you have two Chayis. You have Chayis Prati, and then you have Chayis Klali. I don't even know if Chayis Klali is the right word here. You have the Chayis Prati, and you have the Etzem of the Eibishter. So mitzad the Chayis Prati, you have a very strong bittul, but it's a bittul that's incomplete. And then mitzad the Etzem of the Eibishter, that's not Mitzumtzim, from there comes the total bittul, that the world itself recognizes that it's a lakus. Ein Muvadeh. Now the Rebbe doesn't firuis how this Torah addresses the story of the Alter Rebbe. But the Chayda, it's very, very clear what he's saying. That in Sif Yud, he clarified that everything in creation has two opposites, two extremes. On the one hand, a Chayis Prati, a limited Chayis that is mislabish in the Nivra. And on the other hand, you have the Mehus V'Atzma Sein Soif that is also in that same space as well. So this would be consistent with what we learned in the story of the Alter Rebbe, that on the one hand there was a slapsus and galus. The Alter Rebbe was in prison with the limitations and the confinement of the Meiser. On the other hand, the Alter Rebbe was still balabos, the Alter Rebbe was still in control. There was still Elokus was still in control, and because of that, the world recognized the Einid Muvadei, the Sarei HaMelucha recognized that the Alter Rebbe is an Isha Liki, and gave the Rishus to be Mefarsim Teres Achsidis, and the Gilui that came afterwards on a whole new level. In Sif Yud Aleph, the Rebbe learns Zayirah for us. Seems that we've gone so lofty that we how do we bring this down? So in Sif Yud Aleph, the Rebbe is going to bring this down all to us in a very practical way. Everything that happens in Torah is a lesson for all of us, especially something that happened publicly, especially something that happened to a Nasi B'Yisrael, who's a Neshama Klalis, a Neshama that affects every Yid. Especially since the whole Meiser was the Alter Rebbe's Mesiris Nefesh for Chassidus, for us, for all of Klal Yisrael. And it could be said that the Alter Rebbe opened up the channel that way any Yid could be Moshe Nefesh for serving Hashem with the ways of Teres Achsidus. So this is something that affects every Yid. A, it happened to a Rebbe. B, the Rebbe was Moshe Nefesh. The Alter Rebbe was Moshe Nefesh for Klal Yisrael, and B, the Alter Rebbe, and C, the Alter Rebbe made it possible that any Yid could be Moshe Nefesh for Teres Achsidus. So therefore, we have to learn a lesson. So first of all, the Aved of Yad Nidin gefindet sich in the Cheshach HaGalus, der sein zu verlechten in the Cheshach HaGalus. The Aved of every Yid in the darkness of Galus is to illuminate the darkness durch seine Aved mit der Mitzvah Ter'er, through serving Hashem. Und wir fragen dem Zman von Nixes the Mashiach, especially in this era of the footsteps of Mashiach. In order to be able to illuminate such an incredible darkness, we must depend on a much higher light. The luminary that is in the Torah, the source of light, the essence of Torah, which is revealed in the latest generations, the teachings of Chassidus. Because there's such a darkness, this can lead to hardships, challenges in the Avodah. When a Yid feels not only that Yidden are the minority amongst all the nations, but even within the Jewish people itself, he is of the minority that are involved in the Avodah of spreading Yiddishkeit, the light of mitzvah and the light of Torah, especially spreading the wellsprings of Chassidus. He might say, listen, things are very difficult and no one else is doing it, or hardly anyone else is doing it. So he might say to himself, I'm going to wait until these hardships and these concealments will stop, and then I'll continue the Avodah. Now we have a lesson from the above. The world and everything that exists within it is being created and recreated every single instant from total nothingness. From the it's being created by the Eibishter, that nothing comes before the Eibishter. Therefore, it's not possible that there should be something, there should be an existence that does not allow the Yid to do his Aveda. In Mephis, that will stop the Yid from spreading the light of mitzvah and Torah and to spread the wellsprings. And the fact that he sees, it seems to him that there are these oppositions and these halamis v'estadim, these concealment, therefore wissen, as Tzimtzum is nit kipshutei chas v'shalom. He has to know that the Tzimtzum is not literal. These concealments that you think they exist are not real. And as the kavanah thereby is, and the whole purpose of these seeming concealments, as that he should reveal his chelek elokah, his spark of Hashem, which he has within him, and he should uncover the koiches that the Rabbeim gave him, then he can become the conqueror. We can conquer and we can rule even in a revealed way on all those things that are distracting and that are stopping the person from doing his avodah. When every person does his avodah to conquer the world in his own space, to spread Yiddishkeit and to spread the wellsprings of Chassidus, we hasten even more the coming of Mashiach. Whenever we'll see that Mashiach is that Elokus is the ruler of the world, to the point that the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem like the water fills the ocean. The uftu is that it will be revealed. Even now the Eibush, like I said before, it was not kipshutei. So the Eibush there fills the world literally. Now that's not begali, it's just that we can't see it. When Mashiach comes, then it'll be revealed. We will see the Chayes Eliki, we will see that the world is full of Elokus, and we'll see that the Manis Vikuvim are not, and they're nothing, and we'll be able to continue and to do the Aveda that we're supposed to do. So the lesson, of course, is that now that we know that Tzimtzum is not Kipshutei, and now that we know that everything, the whole world is Bal Telekus, and even a Yerida into Mitzrayim is actually a Kibush, we have to know that we too here in this world, while we're still in Galus, we are in a state of Yerida, but it's a state of Kibush. We're being Kavish to the world, and we're being Shelet on the world, and we're taking over the world through revealing these keiches that we have, that the Eibishter gave us, that the Rabbeim gave us, and we're able to bring to illuminate the world with the light of Torah and Chassidus, and to bring the coming of Mashiach, take it from Yad Mamish.